Hi there friends, this is Margaret Byrd and welcome to Color Quest. I have a big smile on my face because right now I am having so much fun looking at rust as a way to create natural pigment prints on different kinds of fiber. So far we've looked at paper and we've looked at some textile, but today I would like to mix it up just a little bit and see what happens when we bring in a process of binding in order to add some more intrigue to our rust prints. So grab yourself some scrap fiber and those rusty bits you have somewhere in your house, and let's see what binding and rust can do together for us today. So if you've been following, the last two videos here on Color Quest have been exactly what we're going to do today, and that is utilizing the power of iron in its oxidized form of rust to create prints. You can go back and watch those two videos and get an idea of what we're going to do in today's video, but it's a pretty simple process. We are using iron, which is a fantastic resource within our natural dye studio to do all kinds of things. And it's become one of my favorite elements to work with. Taking it to an oxidized state of rust just opens up a whole new door. And I've been starting to bring it into my own creative practice as well. So of course, when you introduce printing, there's so many different ways you can do this. The last two videos, we pretty much just looked at flat lays where we placed the rust on top of our substrate and then maybe folded it. But other than that, we didn't do anything else to the fiber itself. Today, I'd like to look at binding our fiber to the rusty metal itself. By doing this, we are going to be manipulating the fiber, so we'll have even more differences. It's kind of like tie-dyeing, where we're going to be bunching our fiber and binding it to where we create resists, which will repel the rust, and then that'll just add a sort of negative pattern on top of what the rust is going to bring us. Just like we've done in so many videos over the past 3 years with eco printing, we're simply going to be wrapping our fiber around the rusty metal and then using string to tighten it to create folds and patterns and resists that will just enhance our design. So without sounding like a broken record, iron, when it oxidizes, becomes rust. And we do that by introducing our iron metal to water. You probably have rusty material around you, but if you don't, you can always take iron-based metal, like steel, spritz it with some vinegar water, and maybe add a little salt, and put it out into the elements. The moisture will corrode the metal and bring about that rusty oxidized state of iron. That's what we're going to be using to print with. In this process, we're going to help it along a little bit by adding our own spritzes of vinegar water and some salt. The salt acts as an ionization that helps the print attach to the fiber, and the vinegar acts as an acid that continues to help that breakdown of iron to rust and hasten that process of being able to get the rust printed onto our fiber. So let's just get started. So for today's fibers, we're going to be working with silk. I have a silk gift bag here that also has a little tie that goes with it, so we'll be using that. We have some beautiful wool yarn, And then a piece of scrap cotton. This is something that I tried, probably Echo print, didn't quite work well. So I always save it because you can always repurpose this and do something different with it. So we need to wet our fiber first. We always want to work with wet fiber in general in our dye studio. There are a few things you don't need to do that for, but for the most part, wet fiber just allows there to be a better uptake of whatever it is that you are using for a dye or a print, and gets rid of some of the oxygen. Now, wool takes a little bit longer to wet out, so I'll probably have to leave the wool in here for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. You can see the oxygen sort of keeping it from even sinking down in. It also has a protective coating, a natural coating that just makes water a little more difficult to get in. But the other pieces probably will be ready in about 5 minutes. So we'll just let these soak. Now I have just a simple towel here to use once I pull these out. We'll be putting it in here just to damp out the excess moisture. So while those are getting wet, let's take a look at what we're going to be using for our rust today. These are just cans of some kind of food that I pulled from my pantry, and they have been sitting out in the world for at least a year. I just leave them out on my back porch. I spritzed them with water and vinegar combination, and that allowed the rust to come a little bit more quickly and just kind of hasten that process. But it's a super easy way to have a different kind of rusted shape. I have a video where I used these to make echo prints, and you can go back and check that out. But today they're going to be our rusty pieces so that we can see what kind of printing we can do with them. All right, let's start with our silk. Just wring it here, get the excess moisture out, and that little piece goes with it. Then we can take it in our towel and simply fold it over like this to wring out the excess moisture. You want it wet, but not too wet. So I have this larger can, and although I could wrap around, which is what I'll do with the smaller ones, for this, since we have this bag that is actually open, I thought, why don't we put the can inside the bag? So I thought what I would do is play around a little bit with how this will touch. I'm going to just sort of pinch it down a little bit like this, where it's going to be folded over on itself. It may not get much in the way of printing, and that can be really nice, a sort of negative print, if you will. And I want to leave a little bit of room here at the top so that we can put this ribbon that goes around it. I thought we could kind of tie that around there, sort of loosely, tuck it in there. And then in order for this to stay tight, we're going to use some string. I really like to also repurpose my twine or string that I use. You can see this was actually used for some rust printing that I did already, so we'll just go ahead and reuse this string. Now before we tie this up, we also need to add two things to it. One is some vinegar water that I made, which is 2 parts vinegar and 1 part water in a spray bottle, as well as salt. So before we tie this, we're going to spray on a nice generous amount of this vinegar water. And then I'm going to add salt, just kind of sprinkle some salt on. So I'll work on tying this up now with the string. All right, let's move on to our piece of cotton now. As I said, this has already got some kind of botanical printing on it. I thought it would be kind of cool to do a little bit of a different technique here. Let's go ahead and just get it so that it's a little less wet. And I'm going to do very simple fold. I will pull this out, and then I'm simply going to gently fold it. Very simple, gathered folds. Not at all worried about it being uniform. So this one we're going to be wrapping around the can. So we're just going to start off with our folds, and I'm going to loosely take it around the can like this. Super simple stuff. Maybe I'll stretch it a little bit so that it makes use of the rust we have. To keep it attached, I'm simply going to use a rubber band first to hold it. And then I will move this around a little bit so I can find a nice combination of folds and open spaces. And I'd like that yellow to actually be touching the can because I don't like that so much. There we go. Okay, so before we tie it with string, let's go ahead and put our vinegar water on. Put salt. Okay, and then we'll tie this one up. I could leave the rubber bands if I wanted to. They would produce potentially a fairly significant line. So I think I'd rather use string to go around so that I can just have a little bit more even coverage. Tie it off. All right, there's the second one. All right, now time for the wool. It's been sitting here for 15 minutes or so. Squeeze the excess out first, then we'll roll it up in this towel. We have our last rusty can here. I think because we're going to be covering so much of this can up, I'm going to start by spraying the can with some of the vinegar water. And I know I'm getting that on the inside as well too. And this is going to basically be our string, so I can use it just like I did the twine to wrap around the others. All right, now I'm just going to wrap it around. I'm going to cross over on itself a few times and be twisting it a little bit. I want there to be not a uniform rust necessarily, but rather confetti style on the yarn itself. Don't know if that's what I'm gonna get, but that's what I'm thinking about trying. Bring it around here and just tie it gently. There we go. Okay, now I'm gonna go ahead and spray it with the vinegar and add some salt. All right, we have these three ready to go. Everything's been bound up, and just like we've done over the past 2 videos, we're gonna wrap it up in that plastic environment so that we can keep all that moisture in and just help that process of printing along. After about 12 hours, if you open up your plastic and you look at things and you feel as if it needs a little more time or a little bit more of the vinegar water or salt, go ahead and do that. Also, you want to note that with silk, it is a more delicate fiber, and if it is exposed for too long, the risk of tearing or breaking down the fiber is possible. So always best to start with scraps if you have them, or things like I'm using in today's video that are small and you can test it out and just get a sort of feel for it before you put your cherished silk shawl into this process. So far, I haven't burned through my silk, but just know that it is more delicate and you just have to be aware of that. So I have a bin here. This is how I'm going to be storing these pieces, and I've laid a piece of repurposed plastic. I always keep plastic that comes from shipping, then I can use it in my dye studio. So I'm going to take each one of these and I'm going to lay it down in this piece, and I am going to once again add a little bit more of the vinegar water. Just turn those over, and this is where I can add more salt, and then I'm going to cover them, pinch out the air that I can. I'll have to put another piece of plastic on top because we do have some air pockets on either side. I have that here that I can lay right on top and just seal it. All right, we're gonna let these sit and we'll take a peek at them tomorrow. All right, these have been sitting for 24 hours. I actually had to put some more plastic in because I could tell that they were getting dry. If you open these up and you're not happy with the prints, or they dry out within the first 12 hours, feel free to open them up and spritz them again, add a little more salt if you want, and turn them over. That's exactly what I did with all of these, just to allow there to be a little bit more printing going on. This one was only really printing on this outside where it was touching something, which made sense. I did not put a weight on these like I normally do because I only have one weight and I was using it for something else, but I still got quite a bit of printing. Okay, now the fun part. We get to open them up and look at them to see what we got. We will need to let these sit and dry and cure for about 12 hours. That just helps to solidify that bond with the rust and the fiber. And then we will go through the washing and rinsing process. Now remember, you can rinse this and repurpose this. So always try to be using things more than one time. So we definitely got all different kinds of rust on this. It'd be interesting to see how that translated. There is our piece of ribbon, which we definitely got some darker areas there, and then just some overall coloring. You can definitely see the lines of parts of the lines around the can here. I didn't want it to be super uniform, so that's one of the reasons why I went ahead and bunched it in places to try to mix that pattern up a little bit. I didn't want it to look like a tin can, but we got some good variations there. So this is the cotton piece. Remember, this piece actually had been a piece that was a scrap, and I can tell by looking at this, where areas where it got black, that this piece of fiber had been exposed at some point to some tannin. And we'll go more into that in next week's video because there's a beautiful reaction that can happen between iron and tannin, and I absolutely love it. So let's take off the string and see what we've got on this cotton. So we definitely got a lot more areas where it wasn't touching, and then some, it makes this nice sort of chevron design there. And again, there's the black where definitely this has been exposed to tannin at some level. So the cotton piece looks a little different, a little less direct printing and more sort of coloring. All right, here's our last one, the wool yarn. You can see we got a lot more rust on the can just from having that additional salt and vinegar put on top. So this piece is going to be fantastic for another run or two or many. Okay, I was looking for a sort of confetti effect, which we got. We got a nice little patterning of the rust onto the wool. We'll let this one sit and cure. And once we rinse it, hopefully some of these darker spots are going to be well enough embedded into the wool so that it'll be a nice speckled effect on this yarn itself. So remember that you can wash your plastic in places where it has rust. This will come right off with a little soap and water, and you can reuse this plastic again. I'm also going to be rinsing this string. It really can be used so many more times in this kind of a process especially. And then I'm also going to be rinsing off the cans with a little bit of soapy water. And that is just to, just give them another lifespan and just to rinse off some of that excess vinegar as well as the salt. And I'll let these soak a little bit, dry, and then they'll go back outside so that I can use them again and again. So our fiber has sat overnight and it is now ready to rinse. I have 2 buckets here. One will be a bucket that we put in some pH neutral dish soap so that we can wash the pieces. And the second bucket will just be a warm water rinse bucket. We need to get the salt and the vinegar off of the fiber, get them washed and dried, and then we can see what we got. I am going to do this piece last because this is definitely an iron tannin reaction, which means this piece could have more tannin in it, and I don't want to introduce that to the water that I'm going to be rinsing the others in, so we'll do this one last. So let's start off with the wool, and we'll just give it a good swirl, get it going. Then we have our 2 silk pieces, the tie, and then the bag itself. And we'll move those around, give them a good agitation for about a minute or 2. The water's discoloring slightly, but not too much. So I think we got some good adhesion of the rust to the fiber itself. All right, we'll move the wool piece in to the rinse water. If you feel like you want to rinse it a second time, by all means go ahead. I'll let this sit in there for a minute or 2. Move these pieces in. Do the same. Now I can bring this cotton piece in. Move that one around as well. I will remove these and hang them to dry before I put this piece in, just in case there's some tannin contamination that could happen. I want to avoid that on this. All right, we'll get these out and drying. We'll move this to the rinse, and then we will take a look at them and see what we got. All right, everything's been washed and rinsed and dried, and now it's time to take a look at the results. All right, let's take a look at the wool first. Now, I don't knit, but I do like to work with wool because I know a lot of you out there are knitters and weavers and so forth. And here is how it turned out. I think we got a really soft and subtle print on here that I personally think could look really nice in a knitted sweater or sock or something. We still have some areas that are darker and lighter, and so we got a nice sort of variation here on this wool itself. Very simple way to create a patterned effect on your yarn. Now, the silk bag, I really love how this turned out. So we got some really beautiful lines from the ridges that are on the can itself. Look at all of those different bits. I like that it's not super uniform and just going across. If we had wrapped it around on the outside, we could have just gotten straight lines, and maybe that's something that you like, but I like how we have all of these variations. And we also got some nice varied prints on the ribbon itself that's used to tie the bag. So Loving that. This one's probably my favorite so far. Now, here's our piece of cotton. It was just a piece of scrap, and I wanted to try a different kind of binding and wrapping it around the can itself. You can see that we got some of those lines. I actually do like that, but we didn't get too much in the way of prints. We got a uniform color across much of it, a little bit of lines and prints here. We also had some kind of a tannin reaction. I would say overall, I wasn't as happy with this result, but you can see that it does bring about a more soft effect. You could certainly play around more with that. And just wrapping it on the outside will bring you about some kind of a print. Maybe I would go back and wrap it just simply around and not bunch it up. I feel like this one could have had a little bit more printing going on, but that's part of the process. We just keep experimenting and finding the things that we like best. So what do you think? 3 different videos now with ways in which to work with rusty metal to make prints. Did you have one that you liked better than the other? I can say wholeheartedly that there were aspects of each one that I really liked. Using scraps, do it. To repurpose fiber that we've had in the past or something hasn't worked out, and then being able to practice with those, we had some pretty surprising results both in last week and this week. So it's always great. It just adds to our knowledge and maybe piques our curiosity to try different things. Learning by doing is the way to go with most things, and especially in the dye studio. So over the past 2 videos, I have been referring to the tannin iron interaction that has created grays in this process. We've looked at this over the past few years in different ways, and next week on Color Quest, I'd like to dive a little further into tannins and start forcing interactions with the rust itself. So let's explore ways in which we can push this printing process even further. I will see you next Friday. Thank you so much for being here and supporting Color Quest. Absolutely love to have you here on my journey exploring natural color. I just want to be able to have different pieces touching the can. And for this one, we're going to be using this